Well, welcome everybody to our joint Leeds City Council, Leeds Civic Trust joint webinar on the on successful introduction of active travel neighbourhoods. We have a really good panel when we finally get started. We've got a really good panel for you today. We've got national level speakers, people who've been doing this for a long, long time. And we've obviously got people from our own, from Leeds, who are also working on this. And we're going to show you the slide with the programme on it in a moment. And we're going to start off with an introduction from our director. I'm Ruth Colletley, by the way, and I chair the Civic Trust's Transport and Livable Leeds subcommittee. We're going to start with an introduction from Martin Hamilton, who's the director of Civic Trust, and most of you in Leeds will know Martin. And we're then going to move on to Councillor Clyde Lokes, who's been leading on this across the country for many years on the introduction of mini Hollands and active travel neighbourhoods. And then we're going to hear from Brian Deegan, who's done a lot of work, particularly in Manchester, and who's got some really interesting ideas around community engagement and how to get that right. Moving on then to Susan Claris, who is a transport planner from Arup, and she's going to talk to us about the importance of getting widespread uptake of cycling and walking across the whole population. And then we'll hear from Lisa Mulheron, Councillor Lisa Mulheron, whom you all, Leeds people will all know, who's our executive member for climate change and transport. And then Paul Foster, who's the transport strategy manager at Leeds City Council. And then we have a Q&A session. And we're aiming to close about 1:45. Next slide, please, Margot, if you have it. And then just very briefly, we can, if you put your questions into the Q&A box or at any time during the session, and then you can upvote your favourites, and the questions with the most votes will be put to the panel. And you can tweet using the hashtag Leeds ATNs, and the webinar is being recorded and it will be shared on our website. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to hand over to Martin Hamilton to introduce the webinar. Thank you very much. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, I'm delighted to welcome everyone today to this webinar on active travel neighbourhoods. Just a little bit of background from me as director of Leeds Civic Trust. We brought in a transport vision, a transport strategy about 3 years ago. And a key component of that was really how we move from a car-dominated city to one in which walking and cycling was the norm, and one in which health and well-being really took centre stage. So this event and events like this really flow from the vision of Leeds Civic Trust in how we actually get from A to B, if you like. Now, my background is as an elected member. I was a councillor in Headingley Ward in Leeds for 12 years. And I can tell you that that transport and how we experience our streets was high up the list, high up the agenda of residents' concerns. One of the problems I had and we had at the time was how do we actually make practical changes on the ground, particularly when schemes are controversial, when opinions differ, and so how we actually make these things happen in a way that people are able to embrace them in a timely way as well, I think is incredibly important. So when the government launched its emergency active travel fund earlier on this year, in response to COVID, I guess, this gave an opportunity or an excuse even to fast forward some of these aspirations, to try things on the ground, and then to see if they work. And of course, even when you trial things, there is this issue around how you engage in a fast-moving situation, how you ensure that you communicate. And I think above all, it's important that we see people-first neighbourhoods, as we might call them, as something that is part of a broader transport strategy. And so, as we heard from Ruth earlier on, Leeds City Council has just launched a consultation on its new transport strategy, where putting people first, putting walking and cycling first, I think is very much centre stage. And so the key is really how we lock in some of these changes into broader transport strategy rather than just seeing them as tactical or something that is brought in the short term. So really pleased that we're here today. Really pleased to have Leeds City Council and some great speakers lined up for us. And hopefully, what we will do over the next hour or so is, find out about what is happening elsewhere in the country, learn a bit about best practice. How do we consult better? How do we communicate these positive changes in a more effective way? And that will be useful, obviously, for Leeds City Council and the way in which Leeds will want to operate over the next few years. But hopefully also, I know we've got people from other parts of the country, other local authorities, even a couple of people from overseas. And I think hopefully the information that we'll be imparting today in this discussion and debate that we'll be having will help in your discussions as well. So that's all I wanted to say, Ruth. So yes, welcome everyone, and I hope you enjoy the next hour or so.
Thanks very much, Martin. I'd like now to hand over to Councillor Clyde Lokes, and somebody can get Clyde up on the screen. Councillor Clyde has been a councillor in Leiston Ward and Waltham Forest for the past 22 years. He's got a really deep understanding of the workings of local and national UK government, which would be useful in this context. He understands how policies are developed and has helped to shape and deliver for local residents and communities. He provided the political leadership at the outset of the initial bidding process when they were setting up their multi-award-winning, groundbreaking Mini Holland programme in Waltham Forest. And many of you will have heard of the Waltham Forest Mini Holland and the success of that programme after some difficulties, I think. Clyde won the 2016 London Cycling Award Cycling Champion of the Year in recognition of his leadership in Waltham Forest Mini Holland project, and was recognised as one of the top 10 environmental activists in the 2019 Evening Standard Progress 1000 Most Influential People. So over to you, Clyde.
Yeah, just having some problems as ever with Zoom. My apologies. I am unmuted at least. Let me see if I can see on my screen now. No. Hang on. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me along to Leeds this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you very briefly because I've been told strict time limit on our experiencing in delivering Mini Holland in Waltham Forest, which is a London borough, northeast London borough. Over the past 7 years now, we've been working on the delivery of this programme. And for those of you who don't know, this is Waltham Forest in northeast London. It's Chingford in the very north, Leighton and Leytonstone in the very south, which borders kind of Hackney and Newham. And then Walthamstow sits in the middle. And our Mini Holland programme was a programme of substantial infrastructure, segregated cycle tracks, as well as what were then termed villages, then became livable neighbourhoods, then became low traffic neighbourhoods. And in a Leeds context are your active travel neighbours. It's just how the language has evolved, but largely they're all the same, as well as a whole programme of complementary measures. And Mini Holland was a vision of the then Mayor of London, who is now the Prime Minister of the country, to invest a significant amount of money into outer London boroughs to help secure significant mode shift from short-based car journeys primarily to more walking and cycling, and to do that at pace. And we received £27 million to do that. One of the primary case studies that I always use, and lots of people are familiar with, so if you have seen this before, my apologies, is Alford Road in the Walthamstow village. So our villages are largely residential areas, quite often with a commercial or retail outlet in the middle of them, or at some point within those residential areas. Those traditional shopping parades that the Victorians were in particular very good at building into residential areas. Around these residential areas are main roads or B roads, significant roads that were designed and are designed to carry through traffic. However, over the years, the amount of through traffic enabled lovely by sat navs and various mobile phone apps have allowed those residential areas to be increasingly abused and used by rat runners cutting through those residential areas to bypass traffic lights and other control systems on the main roads that are designed to manage large amounts of through traffic. This is Alford Road at the heart of the Walthamstow Village, our first village low traffic neighbourhood scheme. And very narrow pavements, double yellow lines, two-way traffic. This is how it used to be. Actually, you would also normally see lots of cars parking on the double yellow lines. And if you're in a mobility scooter or had you're pushing a small child in a pushchair, you would quite often have to go onto the road to be able to negotiate your way around the parked cars on the pavement. This was our first scheme that we consulted on. Normally in a highway scheme, you get something like a 2 to 3% response rate in Waltham Forest. Not unusual across London for that kind of level of response rate for a highway scheme. In this scheme, we had a response rate of 25% from residents. All of the schemes that we have progressed at the time that we've progressed them have received support from our residents. The only two schemes that haven't been progressed at the time where there was a negative response to the consultation, we didn't progress. Subsequently, those two schemes, residents in those areas have come back to us and asked to be reconsulted, and those schemes were reconsulted earlier on this year, and both have now been delivered during the course of this year. However, take £100+ million out of council tax, out of council budgets as a consequence of austerity, very little public protest. Proposed closing 40 roads to through traffic by the use of modal filters, and all of a sudden we have the biggest demonstrations in the town hall's history on our doorstep. And of course we love a prop in London to kind of emphasize our anger, and we love using emotional language as well. So there's a picture of me on the opening day of the Walthamstow Village scheme with protesters, and there's a coffin next to me, and of course references to the Berlin Wall and our Iron Curtain also.
5 minutes, Clive.
This is what Walthamstow Village looks like now. This is what Alford Road looks like now. Totally transformed, and pedestrians, cyclists, shoppers, visitors are now at the heart of that area. Some figures on the numbers of vehicle movements that we took out of Walthamstow Village by putting in modal filters. Copeland Road, I draw your attention to, the four from the bottom there. These residential streets were massively abused by through traffic, and we've seen this huge turnaround where it's only now the people who live and who are visiting people who live in these areas who are now driving in these areas. Francis Road, again, another largely traditional retail outlet in Leighton, transformed by introducing a timed closure there. Businesses and visitors and residents all taking advantage and utilising the space better than it ever was before, when it was just dominated by through traffic. Perception surveys, what we always do. I know Brian's going to talk about engagement later, but just to emphasise the point that shopkeepers time after time after time overemphasise the amount of parking that they need, overemphasise the amount of their visitors and shoppers who are arriving by car. This is Lea Bridge Road. The bottom two pictures, that's how we used to, we can see that picture squeezed up against the bus, that's how we used to treat cyclists and pedestrians, those people doing the right thing. We used to give them that amount of space. On the other bottom corner, you can see the amount of space, dedicated space, that they now have in Waltham Forest. Lots of pocket parks. We've narrowed loads of junctions, created opportunities for residents to plant, and created lots of pocket parks. Complementary measures, free bike hire. We have huge numbers of free bikes, including a whole fleet of cargo bikes for people to try before they buy. Lots of cycle parking, the green cycle hangers. We have over 500 of those on the streets of Waltham Forest now. We still have a waiting list of 5,000. It's the most of any local authority in the UK, as well as our major transport cycle hubs, parking hubs as well. Snapshot of all that we've done. We've put in 80+ modal filters so far. Modal filters basically stop through traffic, but they enable people to still access their homes by car if they need to. 108% increase in cycling compared to this time last year. 33 new pocket parks, 150 safer junctions for pedestrians. And it's more,
1 more minute now, please, Clive.
it's coming to the end, more than just active travel. This is about transformation. This is about a way of life, community cohesion, community ownership, public health, air quality, economic revival. So it's not just about active travel. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19, we've put in lots of temporary infrastructure, introduced temporary low traffic neighbourhoods, and lots of cycle school streets as well. And however, the anger still continues. So, you know, you've got to provide leadership on this. You've got to lead from the front. You've got to work with your communities and your neighbourhoods, because they are quite often better placed to have some of the discussions with neighbours than you are. However, politicians are still going to be singled out and attacked. So there's a reference to me being like Mugabe, because all I've done is put in cycle lanes and made our neighbourhoods safer, not just for the residents of the here and now, but for the future also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clyde. That was a whistle-stop through a tour, but it's so inspiring to see what you've achieved, and the streets, the before and after slides were just absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much. We'll take questions later, Clyde, if that's all right. And we're going to move on now to Brian Deegan. Brian is one of the leading street designers in the UK, and he has was co-author of the London Cycling Design Standards. He also had a hand in designing Healthy Streets, which many of you will be aware of, the tool that Transport for London has developed to make the streets healthy. Can we move on to Brian when people are ready, whoever sorts that out, please? Brian is, he was, as a designer in Camden Council, he introduced the UK to light segregation for cycling and subsequently assisted Transport for London in testing innovative approaches to cycle-friendly signalisation junctions. He was made National Transport Consultant of the Year in 2006 for his work on the London Cycle Network. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian Deegan, who's going to take us through Why Even Ask. Thanks very much, Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I just mentioned I was running up to Clyde Lokes in his award as well. Anyway, yeah, enough about me. What I want to talk about is like why even ask people, and it's interesting. I'm an engineer by background. I'm going to be talking about community engagement, and really most engineers are trained to design and defend, or really not say anything unless push for a clarification. And I think when it comes to like low traffic neighborhoods, active travel neighborhoods, this is a real issue. So I'm going to talk through some of the best practice on that. Just to start off with, just a little bit of my background in engagement. When I started in cycling in was it the early 2000s, it was very much of that mindset, like that we just built stuff and then he went out, and there was a huge amounts of kerfuffle even then about everything we did. In fact, there was like one cycle campaign group that took us to court every year for what we built, and I thought, well, this doesn't really work. We can't spend, we can't deliver. We need to involve people, particularly the ones that are working against us, which at the time was cycling. The people that hated what we were doing the most were the actual cyclists, which was a real problem working in cycling. But anyway, I did a paper for the Institute of Civil Engineers, kind of the approaches we take, and I put in a few links on this first slide. I've got a lot to cover in these 10 minutes, so I'll show some links for further reading. Also, I'm going to show an exercise from a Be a Champion manual that I've been using in Greater Manchester, and that's got some good active travel neighbourhood exercises in there. And also there's a report that we just put out with the London Cycling Campaign on how to talk to people about the futures of their streets, which contains all the theories in there. So there's some good links there, and I've shown a picture of the collaborative planning process that we used in Greater Manchester. So the idea then was we weren't going to even come up with like a strategic corridor. We were going to involve people, the actual people it affects, all the way through, because really what is the point of how can you make a decision that totally affects people's lives and the quality of it while involving them? It seems ridiculous to even say that, but it's still the way my profession's set up, that we just, obviously we know what's best and we carry on, and everything's just an improvement. Well, things have positive and negative effects on people's lives, and really when it comes to active travel neighbourhoods, you really want to involve people as much as possible. So I'm probably going to say that point another 3 times, but it can't be said enough. So really, yeah, to reference one of the exercises I do on the Be a Champion one, and this is a good follow-on from Clyde's works, because yeah, I mean, he mentioned it briefly, but some of the consultation techniques that they've used in Waltham Forest are really cutting edge and have really set the standard for the rest of the UK. And this exercise that I do in the training course is based on evidence that they've got from their Commonplace website, and it's the Waltham, sorry, one of the villages, I've forgotten which one now. Anyway, Black Horse Village, there we go. I use that kind of area. And what I ask people to do, and this is really the fundamentals that I'm just going to explain all in one slide. You've got the comments that people make on the area, all their issues with it, and want to say, well, here's where those comments have come from, which is the kind of middle bit, the kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see, you can relate a comment to an actual geographic location. Then I say, well, which option would overcome their concern, their issue? And when it comes to active travel neighbourhoods, I'll keep trying to convert it. I'm so used to saying low traffic neighbourhoods. You kind of got stuff that you do inside the kind of neighbourhood, you kind of pocket parks, your filters of play streets, some school streets, trees, social space, all the stuff that Clyde's just shown as examples of. And you got the kind of perimeter treatments. All right, do we need a crossing to get across this barrier in there? Can we do continuous footway so it looks like it effectively closes off an area? And parklets as well for people to park on these kind of streets. So I say to people, match the option with the issue at the location, and that's fundamentally what it is. But like more fundamentally, it's not an active travel neighborhood unless it's come out the mouths of the people that actually live in that community. That's really what makes these different to any other kind of engineering schemes. I mean, really, they all should be like that, but you've got to involve the people. The people have actually got to want it. So I remember when I was first doing that exercise in Manchester, I did it with a bunch of councillors, and we're going through, and we're matching, and then I looked at the homework, and one person had drawn a cycle route right through the middle of the area. I said, well, who asked for that? You've done the exercise wrong. Nobody's asking. It's not what you want, it's what do the people want. So try and match to it. So I'm going to come back to that one, and a little bit of an excerpt there from the how to talk to people about their streets and community charrettes and things like that. I've just done one in the Chiswick area where I got a lot of people together, the community. There was lots of people against any kind of low traffic neighborhood, a few people for, and we just I kind of facilitated the session, and we ended up like getting some really positive results. Now, all those people demanded that what was put in as part of the emergency measures was taken out. So it was a big community upheaval. But by starting it from scratch with a blank paper and like facilitating it and going through these kind of processes, which are well developed now and you can use them, we ended up getting quite a positive result, and the report for that's coming out shortly. So these things work, they help delivery. It's not just a nice add-on. You're not going to really go anywhere unless you involve the community, unless you listen to what they're asking, rather than like just putting up with them. So really, like for the remainder of my time, I'm gonna go through and we're gonna have a think. I like which solution matches the issue, kind of like the exercise I did. But I thought I'd show a few examples. This is what it's all about, as far as I'm concerned. So people, particularly during the emergency that we've just gone through, have been saying, well, we need wider pavements, so like perhaps the social distance, perhaps that they just can't fit, perhaps that they're having to walk in the middle of the road, like in Clyde's example in there. So that's what people have said. What do you do? Nice and easy. There's an emergency response. Okay, we can barrier some space off. Do we need that kind of parking? Can that loading be restricted to further down the street, particularly outside chemists and pharmacies at the moment? Or frankly, do we need more footway there because of pedestrian density issues? Those things can be looked at. So fundamental, again, I'm saying it again, people have asked for it, so this is the response we do. If you go in and say, we're going to widen your pavements because it's good for you, then the businesses are all up in arms. Oh, you're taking away my parking, we're already in strained economic times, how can you do this? But if you can go back to, and this is a fundamental of the Mini Holland approach, which Clyde pioneered, it's like, well, this many people asked for it, that's why we're doing it. And that's part of the collaborative planning process in Manchester as well. I say, well, the network goes that way because that's where you put it. How do I help you deliver your network is my conversation, rather than have you delivered that network that I told you should do. It's a completely different conversation, and one gets you somewhere and the other one doesn't. So we'll show a few more. Yeah, cars are speeding. It's a big issue everywhere. Like everybody has this issue. Even you speak to the most vehemently against like any kind of cycling, walking proposal, say, yeah, cars speeding. What we're going to do about that? And then like as a facilitator and someone like, well, you know, maybe we can do some kind of behavioral change thing. Maybe it's a traffic calming. Here's all the options that we've done. Here's the various evidences that this will reduce it 2 miles an hour. This will reduce it 10 miles an hour, or center line removal, hatching. Then the role is like to give people options for the issue that they have. And I quite like this one, these signs that were put up during the emergency, and the slow down, save lives, just like you're just putting information out there, and it really helps get that message across. And particularly over the past like 9 months, people are a lot more open to these kind of public messages. So wow, that's a good one. I can through these. So yeah, we want to cycle to work, and if we were during the first lockdown, it was like, well, the bus services aren't running and we can't get on them, so we need some other way to cycle to work or to get to work. Hence the pop-up cycle lanes and the rest of it. So what do we do about that? People want to cycle to work. You've got to provide them some safe space on the dedicated routes, particularly on the key commuter corridors. So we've had the rapid cycleway prioritization tool, and I've shown a picture from Leeds here where you put in some like Wandorkers to kind of dedicate some space. So people who wouldn't normally consider cycling on a road like that now see that there's some dedicated protected space, and they can give it a go. Again, it's come out of the mouths of the people. How do we get from A to B, particularly over the last 9 months that we've had these kind of things measure, rather than like it is difficult if you just put these things in. I know we've been asking for the emergency response, but like it's been led by data of where the commuters go. So it kind of works against what I'm saying. But I still think when you're doing your active neighborhoods, people will want stuff on the main roads as well. And what you don't want to say is like, yeah, that's not in our scope. We're just doing stuff on your little residential streets, because the perimeter treatments are just as important as the internal measures as well. Okay. The road's too busy to cross. Okay, how many people are saying that in your local area? That there's probably lots. Now, if you did it the other way around, you say we're going to put a new crossing in, or it could be, well, that's going to cause a delay to the cars going through. That's going to be inconvenient for the drivers. But if you've got like people that say, how do we cross? How do we get to our school? How do we get outside of this this area that we live in? Then you've got more of a scope to actually put stuff in there. So if the road's too busy, excuse the quality of this image. I've not been able to get out of the house much the last 9 months. Someone talking to me. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I've not been able to get out of the house that much. So I've had to take a few things off the internet. But this is a scheme that we did in Wigan, up in Greater Manchester. Yeah, this walking and cycling crossing gets you across 9 lanes. It's right in the centre of town. In our foreground, there's like a residential area, and just behind that industrial estate is the town centre. So that's what people have to come across. It's a fantastic way of getting cars around the city centre. But this kind of crossing, it was done in. There was no capacity loss. We just put something in there, enable people to cross the road. And now like an 8-year-old could ride a bike across 9 lanes of traffic. So we have the engineering solutions. It's just like, who's got the issue? In this case, the people in that area were like, well, how do we get to town in an active way? So there we go. Put some crossings in. I could make the case for crossings all day, but I'll crack on. So
Thanks, Brian. We just need to wrap up now.
Oh, yes, sir. Okay, I'll do it quick. I was waiting for the 5-minute warning. I thought, oh, I'm being really quick. All right,
yeah, you may not have heard it because I may have not quite been unmuted, but yes.
Sorry. Okay, I'll just finish off quickly now. Then, yeah. So we want our kids to play out. Do some like that. There's a modal filter that we tied in with some seesaws that's looking right near the supermarket. Some reason to actually get out of the house is really what it's all about. You know, we want to be able to shop in our local area. Here's like a scheme that we're doing in Tameside to kind of make it a little bit more attractive. We did that visualization before COVID. And there's the report I was talking about. Sorry that I went on a little bit over my time. I always do that. Clyde will verify that. That's the report that I was mainly talking about. So the theory's in there, but just fundamentally involve people or you will come unstuck.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. That's excellent. Really inspiring to hear how you managed to get people engaged and really how you put your heart and soul into getting the community involved. Okay, we're a little bit behind ourselves, folks, but don't worry, we'll keep some time at the end for questions. So we're going to move on straight away now to Susan Claris. Can we get Susan up on the screen? Susan is a transport planner and she's also an anthropologist, which is again interesting, a bit like Brian with a dual qualification. She's worked for Arup for more than 25 years and she focuses on public sector clients. For the last 7 years, she's been championing the role of walking, both as in her own right and also as part of her role in transport in Arab. She led the Cities Alive's report towards Walking World, and she's spoken on numerous conferences and events over the years on the importance and benefits of walking. So she's a woman after my own heart, I have to say. She also led Arab's involvement on the firm's recent report on Sustrans, Cycling for Everyone. Susan was awarded the title of Transport Planner of the Year in 2019 by the Transport Planning Society on the basis of her work in raising the profile of transport planning and particularly active travel, and as well for being a champion for diversity in the transport planning process. So that's really important. So over to you, Susan, now, if we can get your slides up on the screen. Thanks very much.
That's great, thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides and hear me okay. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk today about the case for more walking and cycling. And as Ruth mentioned, I'm speaking both as a transport planner from Arup, but also as Vice President of Living Streets, which is the UK charity for everyday walking. And in my 10 minutes, I really just want to run through some key issues that are featured in a document that was produced last month called The Urgent Case for More Walking and Cycling in the UK. And this was produced by a Walking and Cycling Alliance, which includes Living Streets, but also Sustrans, British Cycling, The Ramblers, We Are Cycling UK. And to run through some of the issues which I'm seeing popping up in the chat already, to do with support versus opposition, congestion, pushing traffic elsewhere, the impacts on business, disability access, emergency services, consultation, and value for money. So there's a link to the document as well at the bottom of this slide, and you'll get the link to the slides later. So the first one is that there is widespread public support for low traffic neighbourhoods and cycle lanes. I appreciate it's not universal, and I'm seeing, I said, a fair bit of opposition coming through on the Q&A. But overall, what we have been finding from the experience of schemes elsewhere is that the people who oppose speak more loudly, and it's the silent majority who do support, and it's enabling all voices to be heard. So there was a YouGov survey that was done during the summer, and this showed that for every one person who was opposing a scheme, there were 6.5 people who were supporting it. Also, it's to note that people's views do change over time. I will be using some Waltham Forest examples, largely because there's 5 years of good data from Waltham Forest. But in Waltham Forest, when the work started, 44% of residents were opposed. But 5 years later, when the schemes have been introduced, fewer than 2% of people said that they would scrap the schemes that have been introduced. And a recent survey done of residents of a low traffic neighbourhood in Lambeth showed that 3/4 of residents were in support of the measures that have been introduced. There's often the view that low traffic neighbourhoods push traffic elsewhere, but actually what we've found is that low traffic neighbourhoods do reduce congestion rather than simply pushing traffic elsewhere. Traffic is not a fixed amount. It doesn't behave like water. So what we have found is that where these restrictions are put in, that it results in some people making fewer trips by car, some people combining multiple trips into one, and some people switching to walking and cycling. Now, we do know that sometimes there are initial increases until things settle down. So, for example, in Walthamstow, initially the traffic went up by about 3 to 11%, but then it went down to 56% on the filtered streets. So just in the same way that when you build new roads, you generate traffic, if you make some journeys less easy, you will reduce traffic. So I said it isn't just a case of simply pushing the traffic elsewhere. The third point to make is that low traffic neighbourhoods, cycle lanes, improving walking is really good for business. And Clyde talked about this in terms of the Waltham Forest example and how shopkeepers often overestimate the number of people who come by car.
5 minutes. Susan.
Thank you. So the people who walk to a high street typically spend 40% more than those who drive. There's more information on this in the Living Streets Pedestrian Pound report. You get increased footfall with public realm improvements. And there was a pilot project in Dundee in July 2020 that showed that retailers and customers were positive about the improvements that were made. The fourth point is about disability access. And low traffic neighbourhoods mean that everyone has enough space to make journeys comfortably. residents, visitors, delivery and service vehicles still have access. They just might need to change their routes. So the idea of LTNs is they deter through traffic. They do not reduce, they do not remove all traffic. And we've found through work that we've done in Sustrans, a report called Cycling for Everyone, that there is large unmet demand for cycling from disabled people. And 31% of disabled people who do not cycle would like to start. It's about creating the right places and the right circumstances to do that. The fifth point is about emergency vehicle access. There's often concern that low traffic neighbourhoods might impede emergency services, but the emergency services have generally been positive about LTNs, and there's evidence that emergency vehicles can respond more quickly in areas with LTNs as they're not held up by the traffic. So again, Waltham Forest response times have been improving from an average of 5 minutes and 43 seconds to 4 minutes and 54 seconds. And there's also the advantage that LTNs do reduce collisions in the first place. And there's been very strong support from medical staff about implementing such measures. The sixth one is about consultation. I just really want to distinguish here between some of the temporary measures that went in at the start of COVID, for example, footway widening. They were done as a temporary, whereas a lot of the LTNs are being put in as an experimental measure. They are the consultation, and it's much better to ask people how they feel about something once it's been implemented and they can see what it's like, rather than what they think the impact will be. And I'm sure we'll have quite a lot of that in terms of the question and answer. And then the seventh and final point is that active travel schemes are great value for money. The average benefit cost ratio for walking and cycling is typically 13 to 1. So for every pound invested, you get a benefit of 13 back. And the Department for Transport's calculations for cycling and walking show returns of between £4 and £19 for every £1 spent. Having said that, there's still only about 2% of total transport spending is on active travel. So for me, it's all about putting people and active travel first, being inclusive in the way of doing this. So putting walking and cycling first, then public transport, then taxis, freight and servicing, and then private vehicles. The private vehicles are still allowed, but they're at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of priority. But as well as doing the good stuff for walking and cycling, you need to have those 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. You need to have those controls on parking, and I think a national road pricing scheme. And at the end of it, it's about the sort of streets and places do we want. These are photographs I take on my lunchtime walks. The one on the left is a road where there's actually a bench where people can sit. There is trees, there are greenery, cars are still allowed, but they don't dominate. The one on the right, very much cars dominated, parking on the footway, blocking the curb. And yes, I was chased down the road from the man whose cars they were because he didn't appreciate me taking a photograph. So just in on 7 minutes, hopefully got you back a couple of extra minutes there. So thank you very much. You're on mute still, Ruth.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed, Susan, and particularly thank you for saving us a couple of minutes. That's fantastic. It's again very inspiring to see the photographs and the changes that we can initiate and we can develop together with communities, really making our streets much more pleasant and safe places to be. Our last two speakers on this particular part of the session are from Leeds City Council. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, Councillor Lisa Mulheron. Everybody in Leeds will know Lisa. She's the Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Development. So, very easy portfolio you have there, Lisa. I know you for the last couple of years and have been extremely impressed by the energy and enthusiasm you're bringing to your job and your constant focus on the inequalities in the city and your attempts to even out the inequalities and really do something for the socially deprived parts of the city. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Ruth. Hopefully everybody can see the slides. Sorry, I'm having to use my iPad, so Margot is very kindly sharing the slides on the screen for me. So first of all, that's who I am, Councillor Lisa Mulheron, Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Developments. If you want to move on to the second slide, please. So I think the previous three speakers have very clearly made the case for why we need greater investment in walking, cycling and public transport to enable people to live active, healthier lives. We have in Leeds ambitions to have an inclusive growth strategy in which everybody benefits from the growth in the economy, in which the health and well-being of all citizens in Leeds is enhanced, and that those who are the poorest improve their health the fastest. And we also have declared a climate emergency in Leeds with an ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030. And across all of those areas of work, we do need to be reducing the reliance on the private car and to be encouraging people to walk, cycle and use public transport more. So if we could move on to the next slide. We obviously are in the middle of a pandemic still. Earlier this year, in the first lockdown, we introduced measures in line with the government's requirements for us to have emergency active travel measures. We initially put in the barriers that you can see on the right-hand side of that screen to make busy parts of our town and city centres more pedestrian friendly, so that those people who were queuing to get into shops at the time could queue and people could safely walk past them. And of course, the pedestrian routes that we have not basically for very many years been wide enough to be able to do that. So we used the barriers that were water filled to broaden out the area for people to safely walk past queues at shops and be able to navigate the city and town centres. On the left-hand side of the screen there shows the Orca ones going in on Otley Road through Headingley. We introduced 2 segregated cycle lanes, pop-up segregated cycle lanes, one on the A65 and one on the A660 as part of those initial measures as well, and created initially 6 school streets, which by the autumn this year have become 13 school streets initiatives to make it safer for children at primary schools to walk, scoot, cycle to get to school as well. Hopefully embedding good habits for life and ensuring that people get used to making shorter journeys on foot, by bike or by cycling or other means that are active travel rather than getting in a car. If we could move on to the next slide, please.
About 3 minutes left, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, I'll speed through then. This slide shows some of the schemes that we're doing across the city to improve public transport provision, but also to pedestrianise parts of the city centre and to create routes into the city that don't rely on people using the private car to get in and out. So on the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, you've got the Sturton Park and Ride scheme, which will be the first solar-powered park and ride with electric buses being used to get in and out of the city. If we go on to the next screen, it also shows the carbon savings. The slide here shows the drop we've had in public transport use. If you recall, as we were coming out of the first lockdown, the government were sending very clear messages that they discouraged people to use public transport, and they were asked to walk and cycle instead. So the emergency active travel measures that we introduced were very much in line with that, making it safer for people to walk and cycle during the pandemic. If we can move on to the next slide. We have been working with our public transport providers in the city as part of our work to prepare for the introduction of the Clean Air Zone. The measures that they have introduced, not only buses, but also taxi and private hire car drivers, to change from petrol and diesel engine vehicles to cleaner vehicles, has been hugely significant in terms of improving the air quality in the city. Can we move on to the next slide, please? That just shows the uptake in terms of ultra low emission vehicles increasing in line with the preparation for the Clean Air Zone. And the next slide, please. That shows the provision now of electric vehicle charging points across the city. And if you go on to the next slide, we have had many changes. That just shows a bit of a timeline from Leeds being the motorway city of the 1960s, 70s, through to our ambitions now to have a city where you don't need to have a car for your mobility needs, but where we actually improve public transport and walking, cycling provision so that people can get about safely and reliably by other means. If we could go on to the final slide, please.
And just one more minute now.
Thank you. Our ambitions in terms of the carbon reductions are very ambitious. It's going to be a huge challenge for us to meet them. But I know Paul's going to talk slightly more in a second about this. We have got a transport strategy, which is in draft form at the moment, which we're going to be putting out to public consultation in the new year. That shows the shift we need to make to meet our carbon ambitions, to tackle a climate emergency, which will also help us to improve the health, well-being of the population in Leeds and meet our inclusive growth targets as well. I'm very happy to talk in more detail under the panel discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa. Those of us who live in Leeds are looking forward to getting really stuck in and getting involved in the next stage, the consultation of the transport strategy. So thank you very much for that. Now I'm just handing over to our last speaker, Paul Foster. Paul is Transport Strategy Manager, and he told me today he's been 16 years in Leeds City Council, so good for you, Paul, is all I can say. And Paul has been leading on the development of the transport strategy. Paul, do you want to say a couple of words just to close this bit of the session, please?
Yes, thank you. So clearly the speakers that have preceded me have covered a lot of the topics on active travel neighbourhoods, and I think the one I wanted to focus on was the dilemma and the challenge of introducing these in what was a relatively short time scale and during a COVID pandemic. And so we've really had to consider how we can do that, and it's been a real challenge. So we started with, if you like, asking the public, and again during the COVID pandemic, how do you do that? So we've done that via an online suggestions website, and we got a huge response. We've had over 29,000 contributions to date on that, all about suggestions from people about where active travel can be improved. So where it's hard to cross roads, where there's too much traffic that affects them, where they feel it's dangerous to cycle. So we got this huge amount of data that came in from the public. We also, of course, as highways engineers, etc., have been working in these areas for years and have got a long list of outstanding issues that we haven't been able to solve, either from resources or funding issues in a number of neighbourhoods. So it started from that basis, and we looked at this. And so given the 12-week time sort of deadline that we were given by DfT to utilise this funding, and again limited funding, interesting that in Waltham Forest it's £27 million to do that, and a really comprehensive scheme over a number of years. We have 700,000 in Leeds, and as Councillor Mulheron's pointed out, we've introduced the cycle lanes, we've done the school streets, we've added some cycle parking across the city, and then looked at how we could introduce some active travel neighbourhoods at the same time. And so really the emphasis on these is how can we do these as trials. So we notified, or we've had some discussions with ward members as representatives of those communities about these schemes, got a buy-in, had an initial amount of consultation. And this is one of the things that I think Brian mentioned. We put this information out there, and we got about, for instance, Hyde Park, 200 responses, the majority of which were in favour of these proposals. Now, clearly, once we've started putting those, and there's a huge population there, over 6,000 people live in that area. And what has happened then is once you actually start putting them on the ground, people really notice about them, despite letters through every door and the information that we had online. Once you actually put them in, that's when we're getting the feedback. And we're having to do these as trials. We're having to do it in a way that allows us to be agile. So these are planters that can be readily moved, and we've obviously had some issues with vandalism of them when we first put them in, so we've looked at dealing with that. There clearly is quite a vocal number of people in the area who've got concerns about these, and what we need to do is address those and bring forward a solution that does work for that area. And we're really conscious of that. But we feel we've been a little bit constrained. It's not how we would have ideally done it, and it's definitely not how we would have done it if there wasn't a pandemic. And there are a number of other schemes that we've introduced in the city, and I noticed in the chat, my colleague Andy Merkel mentioned home zones. We've done these 15 years ago in the Metleys in Leeds, and so successfully involving the community and getting them done. So we're in a situation now where we've got to to look at where we've got to and how we can amend these schemes and make them fit and be right for the community, because there are some huge benefits, as the other speakers have talked about, in terms of these schemes for areas, and if we get the right investment into these areas, we can really improve the environment and the health and well-being of the residents in those areas.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very
Thank
much. Is that it, Paul? Thank you very much
I think
indeed.
I'll do that.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Very grateful. Okay. Thank you to all the speakers. We're now going to ask the speakers to put the videos on, and we're going to go over to the question and answer session. I have to say, folks, we have 53 questions in the question box. I'm not sure how many we're going to get through. We're going to be joined also by Jill Keddy, who's the Development Manager, Sports and Active Lifestyle in Leeds City Council, because she's also been quite involved in the active travel schemes that have been put in and will be in future as well. So if everybody's got their video on, I think what I should do now is go to the questions and take the one that's at the top of the list. Some of these may have been answered a little bit during in the course of the speakers, what the speakers have said. But the first question, the one at the top of the moment, is from Adam O'Malley. And he asks, do you find that a vocal minority against changes to streets are more likely to respond to consultations? Perhaps could I ask Clyde to have a look at that one for us, and maybe Brian as well?
Yeah, I've got to dip in there. I mean, there's always a very loud reaction to this agenda, and that's because, you know, for 30, 40 years we've been saying driving, owning a car is an aspiration and is a right. And all of a sudden, we are saying, well, no, from a public health perspective, from an economy perspective, from a climate emergency perspective, from an air quality perspective, this is fundamentally wrong. And there's now a challenge back. And people are going to be angry. People are going to respond quite in a challenging way. However, from our experience in Waltham Forest, there is, and this is where, you know, your engagement and your consultation and your targeting has to be focused on, not at the one extreme with those who are adamant cyclists, adamant ramblers, walkers, and the other side, the adamant car driver. You have to focus in on the vast majority of people who won't have a particular strong view either way on what active travel neighbourhoods, low traffic neighbourhoods means. They want to see the evidence. They want to be encouraged. They want to be taken through the rationale and the reasons why these are really positive things. Now, of course, in the government's emergency transport funding that we received during lockdown, they made it very clear that the consultation should be done once the schemes were introduced, not in advance of the schemes being introduced. They wanted to try out a new way of engagement, and they've used this as that opportunity. You know, and in some instances where, you know, some of those early conversations haven't been had, you know, this has come like a bolt out of the blue. However, if we cannot even get some of these basic behaviour changes right and moving forward in a way that prioritises active travel, we have no chance in addressing some of the more difficult challenges around the climate emergency. We have no chance in dealing with some of the other challenges around air quality. So we have to make this work, and we have to get this right. And that will always mean very difficult conversations. And that will always mean someone has to put their head above the parapet and provide the leadership on this agenda.
Thank you very much, Clyde. Does any other member of the panel want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I was going to come in. I mean, it's hard to stop that, but I just want to talk about, really, Clyde's nailed it. It's about behaviour change, and any change is difficult, particularly when you're changing your everyday habits. And one of the things I like to bring into sessions when I'm facilitating is, well, all opinions valid. And there's a lot of people on either, you kind of get shut down somewhat, and this is the right way. And I completely go against that. If someone's got a real problem with the scheme, what is the problem? Let's unpack it. And this is the kind of engineering pragmatism that I offer. maybe they've got a point. Maybe they're right. There's always, you've got to entertain that notion. So talk to them. What is it? Let's unpack it. Well, would you be able to tolerate this one? Actually, let's hear from this person. And this is why we invented conversation, and all our streets are a conversation between different people and different needs and different users at different times. It's complex. Let's argue around and go, well, would you be able to accept this on a Friday if they get this on a Saturday? That's the kind of a situation we're in. But what we've all got to acknowledge is that everything's got to change, and at the moment the conversation and the changes are still quite palatable. As we move towards like meeting our climate change targets, it's going to get bigger and bigger draconian steps. So I'm like, let's try and manage the change now in a civilized way. That's really what we're talking about now, because there's going to be times coming, and I'm sure Lisa could come and tell you exactly when those times are coming, where it's going to get a lot bolder and a lot more difficult. But fundamentally, everybody's got a point. Let's listen to it all. Let's have an engaged debate. That's what I hate, when either side gets shut down. As Clyde quite rightly said, there's like we're moderates and we're reasonable in this country, and there's ways that work for everybody, but take every opinion on board. That's my view.
Okay.
Sorry, Lisa. I think the points have been very well made, and clearly the Emergency Active Travel Funding didn't enable us to do the sort of consultation we would want to do with the public locally, and I think Paul set that out in his presentation there at the end. 12 weeks basically from start to those measures being on the ground. We did do what we could do in the time available, but it's not certainly the way we like to do business with citizens in Leeds. And certainly not the way we intend to do business on the second round, which thankfully the government, I think, has heard loud and clear the concerns of the public up and down the country in terms of the way in which these measures have been introduced. It was an emergency, and the funding was labelled emergency funding, and that's why they set it out in the way that they did, with very tight timescales for delivery. So I do appreciate that, but I think it's really important that we are able to have the conversations that we want and need to have with citizens, and we're very well aware of that. So it's something we are doing as an active part of the trials that we've got for our emergency active travel neighbourhoods in Leeds, and we're engaging with local ward councillors and looking to do further work in those local communities as well.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Can I just ask the panelists, I know there's a huge amount you know about this and you have to say, but please try and keep your answers as brief as possible and we get through some more questions. The next question is about the Hyde Park scheme. Now, this was a local scheme which was put in. I think a lot of the points that the panelists have made have probably answered some of the questions, but there's on the specific question of a named person to talk to around this. Paul, do you want to make a comment on that question?
I think just a really challenging point about we obviously had the email address, and there is the opportunity for people to contact us by other means. But again, it was that COVID pandemic, the availability of resources. What I would sort of add to that previous debate on this was, this consultation is ongoing. The platform that we do have for the online allows everyone to see everyone else's comments. So I think that point that Brian was making about it being a conversation, and so hopefully what we get there is a balanced debate, and people can make the points from both sides, and we can fully consider them, and they can see how other people in their neighbourhood feel about them, whether that's pro or against the schemes. And I think that's really important that is happening, and something we are going to look at how we can get some more public meetings working in some way going forward to allow people that opportunity to debate the issues with us as officers, with the local members, and with each other in the community groups, etc. But it's just really challenging at the moment to do that in a COVID secure way.
And thanks very much, Paul. The next question is actually asking about how, under COVID restrictions, which make mass gatherings unfeasible, how effective can consultation be? Anybody else on the panel want to say anything about that? I mean, I think it's all been said, but anybody got any particular points on the challenges under COVID?
I think one of the points I would say, by increasing the amount of online engagement that we've done in recent years, and a lot of that in the with our Connecting Leeds programme on other work that we've been doing on bus priority and schemes in the city centre, the response rates are much higher. So while we've done we've done events in the city centre, we've done face-to-face with stakeholders on the street, etc., and we'll get 100, 200 responses through that forum, but online we'll be into the thousands. So actually we are getting a broader, a bigger number of responses, but there is obviously that question about the demographics and whether we're capturing everyone. And we've done a lot of work with an organisation called Leeds Involving People, who go out into the community organisations, make sure we reach what typically are defined as the hard to reach groups, and make sure we get a view from everyone across that spectrum of society. So we are trying to make sure that happens, and they've got ways of doing that under COVID. But yeah, it's challenging us all.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. I'm just looking through the questions. A lot of them I think we probably have answered in the sense that we've talked about. Clyde, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about how you pushed the changes through in the face of fierce opposition. I think you've.
Oh, we didn't push it through in fierce opposition. We did the quality engagement and consultation that kind of Paul and Lisa and Brian have all alluded to this morning. And public meetings serve a certain function for a certain group of people, but they don't reach that vast majority of people that you're constantly endeavour to engage. People don't want to necessarily leave their house on a Tuesday evening, having put their children to bed, to go and sit next to people who are perhaps getting very emotional, whether they're very for something or very against something. They would much rather, if they can, fill in a leaflet through the door or do something increasingly online. And the benefit of those kind of approaches is you get not just a more quantitative response rate, you get a more quality response rate to some of the questions and some of the challenges that you're posing to people. Whereas what you tend to get in a church hall, and I've done this when we started our process, was 100 very angry people, and the 5 people that had come to find out just a little bit more shouted down and excluded. And that isn't the way to engage, and that isn't the way to consult with people. So, do the quality. That's what you really need. And that then informs better schemes, and that enables you to deliver schemes that ultimately, as we have proved in Waltham Forest, actually have the support of people, and more supportive people of a highway scheme than we've ever had on any other scheme before. Also, you can't ignore social media as an opportunity for people to share their ideas and share their views. And increasingly, there are people out there in the community who aren't council officers, aren't councillors, aren't members of non-governmental organisations associated with active travel or consultants, that are out there in those Facebook groups, on Twitter, on Instagram, who are fighting the corner for these, posing the questions and the challenges to their neighbours as to why they think this is important. So there is a growing way in which people are finding out about these schemes and forming opinions on those schemes. And it isn't just through traditional council avenues neither.
Thank you very much. I'm looking through the questions here and trying to find something that's a little bit different. Several people are asking, which is very positive, how can they go about garnering support for getting active travel neighbourhoods in their part of the city? And I'm just wondering, Lisa, if there's any thought has been given to that.
So we have got the second round of funding from central government. Again, not the sort of levels of funding, unfortunately, Waltham Forest got to deliver their schemes, but we want to work with citizens in Leeds to develop those schemes out. So we had already schools expressed an interest in the School Streets initiative that we weren't able to do in the first round. And I think we've got other areas that would like to work with us in terms of active travel neighbourhoods as well. So we'll be considering the areas that have expressed an interest. We've already got a bit of a shortlist from the feedback we had through the Commonplace platform already. But any areas that do have an interest in adding to that list, please do contact us and let us know. Clearly, we'll be approaching it in a slightly different way now that we have been given a bit more flexibility around the funding from central government in terms of how we take those forward.
Thank you very much, Lisa. There's another question here which touches on a different aspect. It says open-ended consultations about what the issues are in an area and how best the local authority and community can work together and overcome them are usually tied to specific schemes. So how can we use the, oh, my question's disappeared now. Anyway, somebody wanted to ask about how they could use these, how can we use our existing consultation and engagement process for a much wider conversation than the budget might have planned for? I think that's an interesting question because it's setting it in the broader context of climate emergency and how we engage with communities more generally. Anybody want to, Jill, would you like to answer that, have some thought on that? If you're there, Jill Keddy, have you any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think we're currently in the process in terms of having physical activity conversations across the city, citywide conversations about how people feel about Leeds, what stops them being more active, how can we build moving more into everyday life. So we have kind of a citywide network around that, and equally we have teams working in some of our more priority neighbourhoods around those kind of questions. And I think we are exploring very much now with Paul and his teams how those kind of bases of conversations that we're already having and those connections and links into our communities through kind of the organisations and champions and leaders within those kind of neighbourhoods, we can build on the conversations and relationships we're already building to have wider discussions. So when Councillor Mulheron mentioned there the phase 2 schemes coming in, we're really keen to use the work that we've already started as a basis to kind of do much more that quality engagement that's been talked about with the panellists, and are looking really in terms of that phase 2 how we do community engagement in a kind of different way and can build on what we're already doing across the city.
Thanks, Jill. Anybody got any other thoughts on that? I think it's going to be really important going forward that we get these conversations going much more broadly out.
Sorry, yeah. I'll just start to talk. Cheers, Clyde. Yeah, I was just going to say, really, when you're starting any campaign to get a change made, you got to find out who your allies are, and like you find when it comes to like active travel neighbourhoods, the allies are going to be like people who are concerned about social justice, about air quality, about physical activity, about access to work. That name it, but find out who wants the kind of same aims as you do, really, and gather them together, and then you've got like a more powerful voice. And so that's just my quick. I'll do a really quick answer on that one, but find your allies. And they come across all shapes and sizes. And is it health? Probably air quality, I think, is the biggest hook I'm finding around the country at the moment.
Thanks very much, Brian. Just going to take one more quick question. People have asked again about the traffic, the through traffic, which can't use the routes which are closed off. I know that Clyde said that the traffic just sort of disappears. So presumably those journeys are not made, or else they're made in another manner, Clyde. What's your view on that?
Well, it's slightly oversimplistic, Ruth, as to just disappeared. No. So we're now seeing, more people now walking and cycling those short-based car journeys. That a lot of our traffic on our roads in Waltham Forest was. 17% of all traffic on the road in the A and Peak in Waltham Forest is school-based traffic, and yet most people live within 5 to 10 minutes walking distance of their local primary school. So we've had to kind of respond to that. So we are seeing more people walking and cycling as we create the environments that make it safe for people to walk, cycle, and micro scooter to and from their local primary school, their local shopping parade. As we start to give them priority for being able to do that, rather than having to kind of be constantly fearful of sharing space with motor vehicles. So putting in more crossing points where people want to cross, as opposed to where it's convenient for cars to stop. You know, rebalancing that, reinforcing what's already in the highway code about pedestrian priority crossing junction points. Doing all of that. But of course, also, as was alluded to earlier, I can't remember if it was Susan or Margot, around, you know, not providing free parking for people who don't live in your area. So your residential streets become free parking for people. So you take all of that out, introduce the 20 mph, start to create the priority infrastructure that makes it safer for more people to feel comfortable walking, cycling, micro scooting to and from their place of work. There's primary school, whatever, the shops. And then you start to see a huge raft of vehicle movements start to disappear. Also, if you're starting to make it more difficult for your overall area to be used as a giant rat run. So we have a lot of major roads that feed into Waltham Forest, the A406, the A12, the M25, the M11. You know, if Waltham Forest isn't seen as a viable option, then those vehicle movements stay on the roads that were designed for those kind of traffic movements. So they don't start penetrating your residential areas that were designed and laid out mostly before cars were invented, and certainly before mass car ownership was ever a thing, and certainly before sat-nav and phone apps started telling people how to avoid traffic lights and traffic congestion at peak times of the day. You know, this is about preserving residential areas for residents, and that's how it should be.
I think that's just a wonderful note to finish this on, Clyde, because that's exactly what this is all about. We've come to the end of our session, and I apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to, but I hope we've covered the key points in this. It's been really exciting. It's a really good time for us to have had this joint seminar between the Leeds City Council and the Civic Trust, because as we mentioned earlier, Leeds City Council has just launched its transport strategy, and that's going to go out to consultation. And I would exhort everybody on this webinar to really to download the document, to get engaged at local level within your community groups, everywhere you can, to get engaged in the discussion with your local councillors, with your schools, everywhere you can. Get engaged in the discussion about what sort of neighbourhoods we want to live in. How are we going to tackle climate emergency, poor air quality, lack of physical activity? All of these things are rooted at the moment in our dependency in our car dependency, and we have to tackle them together as a population in this city. So I'd just like to finish by thanking all our speakers. Really grateful to everybody for a really interesting and lively discussion. Thank you very much indeed, especially to our external speakers, Clyde, Brian, and Susan, and also to Lisa and the members of the panel. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, and we'll close this session now. Thank you very much, Civic Trust, too, for hosting us. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.